In the history of the Middle Ages, the most fearsome of the steppe nomad warriors have got to be the Turkic and Mongolic tribes spanning from Crimea to Lake Baikal. It's easy to assume that the power of the recurve bow shot from horseback was exclusive to those cultures, who maybe it could be argued mastered its application against sedentary societies. It's all too easy, though, to forget the role of the terrifying Indo-Europeans of the Classical Age as one of the first horseback archer nomads to ravage civilization, the Scythians. Like all the steppe nomads of time, the Scythians were mercenaries, traders, warriors, raiders, and despoilers, all depending on who they were interacting with. By the time of Crusader Kings 3, there are and have been no Scythians for a few centuries, but it is often theorized that the Alans of the Caucasus are the inheritors of the Scythian heritage. The Alans, particularly in this era, were often mercenaries rather than state builders like their ancestors. By the 9th century, there were no continent-spanning Alan confederations, but rather a humble yet strong kingdom which broke free from the Khazars shortly after CK3's start date. Unfortunately, CK3 simulates the Khazars as being far more stable and powerful than they were, which means we don't often see a true kingdom of Alania in the game. Regardless of the existence of an Alan realm or not, Alans often served as mercenaries for whatever powers wanted to harness the power of the recurve bow, and that brings us to the subject of today's protagonist. This is Taus, a hardened Alan mercenary who fought for the Abbasids in border scuffles against the Kurds, whose Tawashi cavalry were proving difficult for the Abbasid Mubarazan. Although most steppe nomads are not well suited to mountain warfare, the Alans are especially capable in mountainous cavalry warfare, akin to the Kurds that Taus was fighting. After the Caliph failed to provide payment to Taus, who lost his leg in the fighting, he occupied Kermanshah, declaring that he would not leave, for he would be unable to make the trip back home to Alania without his leg. Rather than deal with yet another problematic mountain people, the Caliph offered Taus vassalage and conversion to Islam in return for a noble dynasty, land, and protection. Land was, perhaps, more valuable than gold even, and for that reason Taus accepted, being assigned the feminine name Awar, meaning bright in Arabic, a reference to the fair skin of the Alans. With that, we begin the game as Taus Awar in the Duchy of Kermanshah. Taus is new to nobility, and what he'll do with this land could irrevocably alter the region. Let's find out. Taus is something of a retired soldier. He's always been well suited to war, but with his leg gone and his body aching from years of marching, fighting, and yelling, his early 30s left him feeling twice his age. First, he took a wife, a low-born but talented Sogdian named Argavan. Taus both liked her for her intelligence and also was hoping she could be useful in learning how to administer his realm. She immediately suggested he work on some grazing land development around the mountains for his army's horses, as it hadn't quite clicked for Taus that he would have to settle into a nomadic life, and he'd have to actually cultivate grazing land rather than just move to a new spot. This sort of advice was exactly what he married Argavan for. News of Taus's new realm in Persia spread back to the Caucasus, and with that news came a migration of Alans, who were looking to settle these new mountains and replace the local Kurds. The Kurds, being fiercely independent, would resist these incursions, but at the same time, Taus was in no rush to bring in an Alan majority, so it would be a long process. The Caliph checked in on Taus, looking to see how his new subject was faring, and perhaps hoping he would quell the Kurds, which it seemed like perhaps he was. Caliph al-Mutaz was happy with that and offered to Taus a blank check favor, which Argavan recommended he use to obtain a permanent seat on the Caliphal Council and secure himself the seat of steward. With that new role, Kermanshah began pulling in huge revenues, and it was looking like this frontier Kurdo-Alan realm would flourish. Nonetheless, Taus was still a nomad by nature and a warrior. Without conflict, he was bored, and so he began hunting for sport. There was something about seeing one of God's creatures cowering before you, whimpering for its life, that was just intoxicating to the battle-hardened soldier, although it was an opinion not appreciated by most of his subjects. The court went out to Arivajan to hunt, which attracted hunters from across the Arab and Persian world who wanted to observe the hunting practices of a steppe nomad. The hunters went out for a hyena, and although most of the Arabs there were suggesting a well-placed arrow, Taus stoically grabbed a spear and simply ended the hyena, savoring its death. Although impressive, such cruelty was rather unseemly to most of the observers. Feeling proud of his kill, Taus traveled to Baghdad with the hyena fangs he procured from the corpse, and along with an Arabic tutor to give him some basics to get by at court, he paid homage to his lord. Little did he know that the road to Baghdad was filled with dangers. He encountered some poisonous flora, which he ate, but thankfully his iron stomach processed the poison safely, and he encountered some raving Christian who he burned alive for the spectacle. Upon arriving in Baghdad, he bowed before his lord and swore an oath in Arabic, which he had practiced on the way. Unfortunately, his accent was quite thick, and he mispronounced most of it, getting himself laughed out of court. Such an embarrassment was bad indeed, but what was worse was that on the way back, Taus came down with typhus. The Caliph most likely had nothing to do with this, but Taus did not feel this way. It was clear to him that the Caliph's laughter inflicted upon him this curse of typhus, with the hope of killing him. The Caliph clearly did not enjoy that rather than subjugate and tame the Kurds, Taus had been tolerating them. He quickly recovered from the typhus thanks to his powerful build and began his plot to get revenge on the Caliph. It's important to note here that Taus is quite uneducated about disease and probably didn't even believe in it. It might seem unreasonable to so quickly blame someone for a plague, but it all made sense in Taus's somewhat superstitious mind. He organized a great feast, with the outward intent of celebrating his liege and hoping to make it up to him that his oath was so botched. Maybe he could regain prestige in the eyes of his liege, at least that was the supposed purpose. Instead, Taus was intending to serve Al-Mutaz his last meal. It was a daring plot, but Taus was used to high-pressure situations. The feast began and it was all over within a few moments. Mutaz entered the hall early looking to link up with the host beforehand, and at first things were okay. Then the Caliph couldn't help but jab a little bit at Taus for his failures before, and although his Arabic was not yet good enough to really comprehend what was said, the look on the Caliph's face was enough to convince Taus to just end it right there. Sometimes, arrogant Caliphs can forget the reflexes and ability with a blade that even a one-legged veteran can have, and the Caliph's heart was pierced, with only one of his servant girls as a witness. Her life was ended with a surprise knife from Argovan, who despite only knowing her husband briefly, was already on board with his ambition. As guests flocked to the feast, servants buried the Caliph, and when he never arrived to the feast, he was declared missing. The feast had an air of solemnity, even though Taus was ecstatic inside. Some days later, the Caliph never appeared, with the assumption being that the Kurdish brigands took revenge on him for their subjugation, and so the new Caliph, Abdullah, son of Al-Mutaz, was crowned, and the Arabian Empire would undergo a period of unprecedented instability, all on account of a poor target for a laugh. It was also shortly after this that Taus gave up on studying Arabic. Although he wanted to get better at the language in the hopes of not being laughed at again, the language really was beyond him. "Why can't they write the vowels down? Why must it be a guessing game every time?" he screamed as he tore his grammar book in half, and his Arabic tutor left the room in fear. For now, the realm maintained a brief period of peace, as Kermanshah continued to develop, and Taus took more trips out of the hinterlands looking for beasts to fell. That was, until scouts reported enemies approaching the frontier, and it was not a small matter. It seemed that without a competent Caliph to protect the realm, the promise that Mutaz had made to Taus to protect his realm as a vassal could not be upheld by his heir, Abdullah, who wasn't even aware of the promise. Oa's Turks rode through the mountain passes of the Zagros, aided by Kurdish mountaineers, hoping that these Turks would be their liberators. Reluctantly, Taus offered his hand to aid the Caliph, given that these Turks were intent on taking his personal domain, but Taus hadn't prepared his army for an incursion of this strength, and the Caliph was still occupied with the Romans in the west. Rather than pack up and go home though, he did take the time to complete his hunt before getting ready for war. He was outnumbered about 4 to 1, and so chose to keep his men garrisoned while waiting for the Arab armies. It already looked desperate enough with the Oghuz vanguard sieging Saimara, and then their backup, the Kyrgyz, arrived and turned the numbers into an 8 to 1 conflict. The Arabs were almost as numerous, bringing about 5,000 men to the fight, but their men were just target practice for the skilled Turkish archer cavalry, and the Alans were too few to fight off so many Turks. Worse yet, the Turks had brought Chinese siege equipment, likely provided by the Kyrgyz, to bring down the walls, while the Caliph had no such engines. After Masabadan and Badaraya fell to the pounding onagers, the Turkic armies rode east to confront the Arab-Alan coalition, which they soundly defeated. The Alans retreated south, and it was at this point that Taus accepted that his new home was soon to be no longer his. Rather than try and fight alongside the horrifically unprepared Arab army, he instead marched north, ignoring the Turks, and asked passers-by about major settlements nearby which were not subject to the Caliph. He had a plan. He heard word of the Bunakids of Azerbaijan and their opposition to the Caliph. It was obvious that Taus couldn't just up and steal land from another Arab lord, given he was subject to the same lord and would likely be arrested for such a move. Instead, he would go on a campaign to take new land for his liege and himself. He marched into Azerbaijan through the western Zagros mountains and found that the Bunakids were far too busy helping their allies in Daylam, and Taus stole the city of Bailakan from the Turks there, who weren't expecting an army to invade, as they assumed the Arabs were too busy to go on the offensive. This new Alan homeland was more mountainous and treacherous than Kermanshah, but it was better than being landless, and the caliphal authorities had no issue with the conquest that added to the empire's power. Of course, Taus had every intention of reclaiming his land from the Turks later, but for now he would focus on building up his new land into a base of operations. Despite hoping to avoid a new life of military campaigns, it seemed that conflict would always follow this poor Alan soldier. Luckily for him, the population of Bailakan was low enough that the Alans who had come to Kermanshah were able to escape and establish a majority in the area right away, which would mean issues with Kurdish locals would not be relevant for now. Unfortunately, most of his Bedouin and Persian administrators were either killed by the Turks or didn't make it through the harsh mountains, meaning that there were quite a few vacancies in the Alan court. Looking to bring in some talented people, Taus announced he would embrace Mutazilism, which he had been told was a rationalist and scholarly form of Islam that would bring in skilled scholars to help in his legal and administrative sectors. He began work immediately on renovating his humble home of Bailakan. Oh, and a side note, Taus only continued to develop his cruelty and sadism, as there were a few Kurdish minority peasants in the area. Rather than expel them, or kill them simply and dispose of them, Taus chose to process their bodies into supplies for his garrison. Although they were not aware, his soldiers were enjoying fresh rations with plentiful proteins, which they found to taste like nothing they'd ever had before. They were told that the sheep and goats of Azerbaijan were just different that way. His well-fed troops were put to work constructing an aqueduct under the guidance of a local mayor, while Taus himself planned for potential retaliation from the Bunakid emir, Bunek. The man was not known for his initiative, but nonetheless, reprisal was likely, if not certain. Rather than respond to his move, though, Taus planned to eliminate the emir using his disloyal Iranian subjects to plan his demise. Unfortunately, the plot was quickly uncovered, and so Taus had to rely on the incompetence of his Turkic neighbor and the already questionable ability of his liege to keep him safe, as his soldiers were in no place to wage a war at the moment. Indeed, questionable was the right word for his liege, as news spread to the Alan court the city of Baghdad had fallen to Turkic nomads. Taus hadn't realized that the caliph he had killed was so integral to the empire, but it turns out that without good leadership, the Abbasid Empire was ripe for the picking by these nomads. In all honesty, Taus wasn't one for politics, so he genuinely hadn't expected that one man's death could so rapidly collapse an empire. On the right side, one of Taus' other wives, Parveen, gave birth to a son, Aravat, which meant a true lineage could begin here. Taus had already been blessed with 3 daughters, but the lack of a son was indeed worrying, given Islamic law wouldn't let a woman rule. With the aqueduct projects complete in Bailakan, the steward who oversaw the project, Kolo, brought to Taus' attention that he ought to do a survey and figure out who exactly lives here and figure out how to tax them best, as the aqueduct was expensive and the soldiers expected pay. Of course, Taus trusted his steward, and reporters were sent out in the mountains to do head counts and get an idea of what local peasants produce. Alongside that, being aware of strategically important choke points would help keep the realm safe in case an invasion did come. These records were made public, and suddenly Bailakan was growing from a tiny backwater into a much larger city. The aqueduct brought water from the Zagros mountains down to the city, and the Alans were entirely tolerant of any local people who found their new rulers to actually be quite acceptable. The Kurds were a bit skittish while being subjugated, but at least they were allowed to live in their own way with their own traditions. There were even some Yazidi Kurds collecting in small communities, feeling safe to openly practice, as the Alans had already made it clear that they came from a part of the world that doesn't really care much to enforce religious homogeneity. While Alans continued to flock to Bailakan from Old Alania, the identity of most of the Alans in the area, including Taus, was shifting. They were learning from the neighboring Kurds more and more about living in the mountains, instead of just fighting in them, and the Alans in the area were known as the Roksholani, the Shining Alans, an endonym in reference to Taus' Arab-assigned dynasty name, Awar, and a nod to the historical Shining Alans of Crimea, who were vaguely in the memory of these Alans. The Roksholani weren't much different from their Caucasian cousins, simply being more adapted to the steeper mountains of the Zagros, and integrating some of the bureaucratic and administrative skills of their Arab and Persian neighbors. Taus had become so emblematic of the region's flourishing development that Bailakan as a city had expanded far beyond its original sprawl. Now, the new city was known as Tausinia, which was quite an honor for the humble soldier. It was in this time of prosperity that Taus saw his old conquerors, the Turks of Kermanshah, were under siege from the Hamadan Persians, and he took up the opportunity to invade the region while his people continued developing Tausinia. He saw initial success, but unfortunately his army was intercepted by the Persians, who didn't want interlopers involved in what they considered their conflict. Once the Persians completed their war, though, the Turks were able to reacquire some allies, and in so doing, turned the war against Taus. But rather than let Tausinia be looted, he surrendered the war and paid his opponent reparations. It was painful, but better than losing the progress his humble home had made. Out of character here, I had so many modifiers on my county that it broke the UI. Nice. I wasn't even trying to make this happen, it just kinda did. Taus' daughter, Lamara, came of age, and it was at this point that a choice presented itself. Lamara is technically a princess, given that she is the daughter of nobility, and she could be married off to secure alliances or merge realms. Alternatively, her hand in marriage could be used to convince a low-board administrator to come to the realm and organize great urban projects in the difficult mountain terrain. Such an administrator was indeed found, as Lamara was promised to Muzaffar ad-Din, an Arab with experience in the Abbasid civil service. He arrived in Tausinia, was married to a girl less than half his age, and then put to work creating a mountain metropolis. Muzaffar ad-Din handled the administration of the realm, while Taus reaped the rewards and reinvested them into hunting for sport. Many of his Kurdish subjects were mandated to report of any interesting game in the wilderness, and one day, he received word of an albino lion in the mountains with a beautiful snow-like mane. The claim was probably a lie, but why not check it out? Taus organized a hunting party and rode into the mountains. Imagine, if you will, a burgeoning city under the supervision of a skilled Arab administrator protected by hardened steppe veterans, with a magnificent hall, dedicated to its founder, featuring the magnificent mane of the rarest of lions. The image was tantalizing to our protagonist, and so the hunt for the lion became his sole obsession. It was lucky that both his wife and Arab administrator were competent enough to mostly handle the realm, as Taos had more or less abandoned his duties. The beast's existence was confirmed when Taos laid eyes on it himself for the first time. This was no rumor. His obsession had been dragged out of the hypothetical realm and into reality. Although spotted, the beast was not felled, and so another hunting party had to be assembled in order to secure the beast's hide, but they would have to wait for the next hunting season. Taos did nothing but await news from his scouts about sightings of the lion, and once the hunting season came up, he went out once more into the mountains. It was good that Taos had listened to his previous steward's advice and surveyed the land, as every time the lion was spotted, he was quickly able to find the location and begin his hunt. That being said, no amount of support from fellow hunters nor his scouts could make the lion easy to find. It enjoyed hiding away, understanding that humans were a threat, and it often chose the most difficult of caves to access as its resting spot. It was unusual that a lion would rest in a cave, as they often enjoyed uncontested territory, but this particular lion suffered from albinism and avoided the sun when possible. After yet another failed hunt, Taos was starting to feel the stress of all these hikes and outdoors take a toll on his body. He had to put in extra effort on account of his missing leg, and during one hunt he was particularly lethargic. It was at this point that he collapsed and awoke in a comfortable bed, struggling for even basic movements. He was infirm and could no longer muster the strength to hunt for the lion. He was angry, but more so he was realizing that his time was running out. Nonetheless, he felt great happiness at the success of his city, Tausinia, and took pride in both his wife and his steward's effort. It was no Rome, nor Constantinople, but it was turning into a modest city. Impressive, considering that what stood there could barely qualify as even civilized. Impressive, considering that what stood before could barely qualify as even civilized. Before entering his chambers and accepting his bedridden state, Taos enjoyed a delicious meal provided by one of his loyal servants, threw his Arabic armor book across the room one last time, and declared a war to retake Kermanshah. If he could avenge this final slight against him, and take his rightful claims back, his legacy would truly be untarnished. By this time, the fierce Turkish nomads that had conquered his land had settled, grown decadent, and become weak. Meanwhile, his strength only had flourished in Tausinia, and so the war was declared, and swiftly won, after Kermanshah's garrison surrendered. As another accomplishment to put under his belt, he declared a war to take all of Azerbaijan from his fellow elderly lord, Bunek, whose land he had conquered as a refuge. Bunek's inaction would prove his demise, as Taos had built up enough strength to invade Tabriz and claim it for the Shining Alans. Azerbaijan became the seat of a new emirate, with Alans from all over flooding in to settle this new prosperous homeland. They were lured in by stories of exotic beasts and beautiful sights, alongside awesome cities, although reality would show that these cities, while impressive for their locations, were ultimately relatively small. Muzaffar ad-Din began working on cultivating the arable land in Tabriz and Maraga, which would go on to generate great revenues for Taos and his descendants. All this excitement ultimately left Taos complacent. Believing he had eradicated all his enemies, he let his guard down, and due to that, his life was brought to an early end by an unknown assassin. It wasn't too tragic given that he was already in his 70s and his death was expected anyway, but this left his son, Aravat, in charge of a bustling realm. Taos had been focused almost entirely on his own pursuits, leaving the realm mostly in the hands of his counselors. He had been tasked by the Caliph to subdue the Kurds and protect the borderlands, only to murder that very Caliph and to promptly lose control of the borderlands to Turks, while emboldening Kurdish minorities. He'd go down in history as something of a renegade, especially for taking over a city, renaming it after himself, and promptly reconquering the land he lost. The common thread behind Taos' behavior was always his self-interested, daring, and at times shocking actions. His son, Aravat, respected him, but to say that the boy is a little more interested in the world of nobility would be an understatement. He obtained the throne on October 21st of 909, and it seemed his subjects were happy to see him crowned. Aravat came up in a much different environment than his father. He was educated and intelligent. He was surrounded by servants and taught by his father's first wife, Argavan, about how to operate in a court. He was taught by the steward, Muzaffar ad-Din, about the ways of Arab court politics and architecture. That being said, Aravat is a foreigner in the eyes of pretty much everyone in the realm. It's unlikely he can make progress in furthering the realm through traditional means. No, Aravat intends on making his goals happen as he sees fit. He's a masterful plotter and planner, with the patience to let even the longest of plans come to fruition. He wants power, and he has the brains to obtain it. In many ways, he's just like his father, as he dives into sticky situations, believing that he can accomplish the task, no matter the difficulty, but he's in other ways the opposite. Where Taos was sometimes brash and foolhardy, Aravat is steady and forbearing. Where Taos was cruel and unfriendly, Aravat was a smooth talker and friendly. There are two factions within the counselors and courtiers of the Alan court: those who want to work with the Caliph and those who want to work against him. Of course, both factions are seeking to further their own interests, but in feigning support for the Caliphate, some believe that they can more effectively gain power for their people. Aravad is of such a faction, as he hopes to spread his family's roots throughout the Empire and Persia. He's not his father, and on account of that, isn't confident using war to gain power, except through overwhelming force. Instead, convenient lethal accidents and blackmail are Aravat's sword and shield. Unfortunately for the ambitious Alan, his brothers have fractured the realm. It's likely that he could convince his brothers to help his cause, given that family relations are quite harmonious, but there's no need to include more variables than necessary, so one of Aravat's first actions as Emir was to inherit the domain of his siblings, a task easily accomplished. It was interesting to evaluate the state of the Arabian Empire, as things were relatively stable, at least war-wise, but the identity of the Arabian Empire was falling apart on account of the floodplains of Mesopotamia being ruled by Turks. The Sartuchid Emirate, a rising Bashkir power, was dominating the region, but a recent succession has divided the emirate between 4 brothers. The jewel of the Arabian world is, without a doubt, the heartlands of Babylon, and with the Sartuchids looking weak, Aravat's got his eyes on it. For now, most of his plans to get the family around the empire will depend on him actually having kids first, so there's some time needed for that. In order to make a strong opening, Aravat arranged a grand wedding between himself and a Tahirid princess. This was a controversial choice given she was a Zaidi from outside the empire, which could be seen as a sign of opposition to the Caliph. Nonetheless, the intended effect was to bring attention to the Alans, which it did. Everyone was attending this wedding for sure. It was a great success, with nobles from across the empire and Persia attending and building onto Aravat's fame. The wedding gifts alone actually covered the cost of the wedding, meaning he even made a profit. From there, he hosted feasts, hunts, and any other event that could orient the realm around him. Tabriz and its hinterlands are rich farmlands which have been generating immense income for Aravat. He had spent most of the money on these activities as well as on an army, which was wise considering more Turks were being sponsored to invade, and their new target was Azerbaijan. Aravat refused to be like his father and lose his land, so he joined the Caliph in defense of the realm. This served the double purpose of earning the Caliph's trust and letting him protect his domain. By this point, the Caliphate had somewhat stabilized, and so the Turks were defeated without much worry. While defending his land, Aravat realized that another lord, the Emir of Kufa, had taken Baghdad for himself, which meant the prize went to him instead. Perhaps eventually the Alans could control the House of Wisdom, but for now it looks like the Jewel of Arabia will remain under Arab control. In 919, Aravat had his first son, Rosmag, who he has huge plans for. Rosmag will immediately get married into the Tahirid family so as to build an even stronger connection with the ever-growing Tajik power. The idea is to build strong familiar relations and then perhaps eliminate problematic Tahirids such that the heir may eventually be from the Awar family. Alongside that marriage, he also arranged for the second-born Tahirid son, Paiman, to be promised to his daughter, Tinatini. They were married matrilineally, which seemed fine since he was a second-born son, but the Emir-e-Emiran hadn't accounted for the potential that his firstborn could pass away, especially when such an event was highly desirable to a skilled schemer like Aravat. While plotting the death of the Tahirid firstborn and his descendants, Aravat received permission from the Tahirids to invade the Dulafid Emirate, which was considered under Tahirid influence at the time. Due to their family connections, the Tahirids were willing to accept a replacement in powers in Hamadan with the Alans, and thus Tabriz and Kermanshah were joined by land. With the marriages all set up, all Aravat had to do now was develop his land and wait for the right moment to remove obstacles to his family's power grab. Unfortunately, the Tahirids were surprisingly unstable. Many pretenders had seen the Tahirids allying with foreign powers and feared that they were in danger, so rather than let them have the initiative, they rose up, pressing their claims. Naturally, the Tajik Amir called upon his Alan allies, and Aravat did accept the call, marching troops through Daylam to help, but after seeing the overwhelming power of the Tahirid pretenders, Aravat chose instead to come home. This conflict would be prohibitively expensive, and so the Tajiks would have to handle it themselves. The chaos of one pretender war only fed the flames of further fighting, and so the civil wars escalated until the Tahirids, who Aravat had invested so much into, were seeming to already be collapsing. This was unfortunate, as most of the plotting and scheming he had put so much effort into seemed to be going to waste. The Tahirids were no longer even a valuable ally, given their army was busy fighting its own subjects. Looking for influence elsewhere, Aravat sought blackmail on the Caliph. It would be invaluable to have something to hang over the Caliph's head, which would of course cast him in a bad light in the Caliph's eyes, but it would likely be worthwhile anyway. After some time, Aravat managed to get what he wanted, but without any of the suspicious accusations of true blackmail. No, instead he would earn the complete loyalty of the Caliph by saving his life from bandits. Now, of course, those bandits were put there by Aravat himself, but no one had to know that. Aravat and his guards saved Caliph Nasruddin from certain death, and the honorable Caliph, of course, promised his savior any favor in return for the help. This favor, Aravat used right away to get a marriage favor with the Caliph, and although the Caliph has no children besides his firstborn son, who he will likely save for later, he will eventually have children that can be married, and with some scheming, perhaps the firstborn son could be made to disappear, leaving an inconveniently married second or third born son to inherit. At least that's the idea. From here, time was the last necessary factor for Aravat's power grab, and while waiting for time to pass, he focused on grooming his heir, Rosmag. Barring some occasional scuffles with Turkic invaders and the routines of rulership, Aravat's reign remained stable. That being said, it was not easy. Aravat lived an extremely stressful life compared to his father, given that he had a much more personal touch with regards to rulership. Where Taus spent his time searching for administrators to delegate, Aravat tried to be a true statesman. Simultaneously, every plot he'd put together had more or less fallen apart. Aside from gaining the total trust of the Caliph, he had no real power in the realm. The Tahirids had entirely collapsed under their own weight before any weddings in that realm could come to fruition, and the Caliph hadn't kept to his marriage promise with any particular haste. Heading into his 50s, Aravat's daring nature was replaced with anger, as he found that his patience and bravery was simply not paying off. That wasn't to say that his realm was doing poorly, quite the opposite, as the Emirate of Azerbaijan, run from Tausinia, was prospering culturally, economically, and even militarily. Indeed, Aravat oversaw the immense growth of the entire Alan population, which had come to dominate the western Zagros Mountains, coexisting with their Kurdish subjects, but mostly ousting the Elamites and Persians. Thanks to the influx of Mutazilite scholars, the realm was even a bastion of learning and knowledge, although that can't be directly attributed to Aravat. Shortly after establishing yet another irrigation system to bring fresh water from Tabriz to Tausinia, Aravat collapsed from the stress of the illusion that he was a failure, and so passed away at the age of 51. He would be remembered as a schemer who ultimately didn't accomplish much of his own goals, but who, perhaps unknowingly, had driven his realm into its peak up till then. He left his son, Rosmag, who was only 14, to rule the realm, and Kermanshah was left in the hands of his second-born son, Taimuras, who he had mostly left to his own devices. Rosmag certainly has a softer touch than his father and grandfather, focusing on understanding the world around him, which he was encouraged to do by his Arabic and Persian teachers. It is an interesting choice for Emir, but also perhaps exactly what they need right now. Time will tell. What makes the difference between a realm and a nation? A realm is the domain of its ruler, but a nation is the domain of a people, and to say that the genesis of the proper Rukshalani nation had already begun was an understatement. So far, these shining Alans, although still identifying with their Caucasus cousins, were mixing with their neighbors enough that the distinction was solidified. By now, Kurdish culture had spread to the Rukshalani enough that they felt closer to the Kurds than to the Alans. Of course, none of this was known to Rosmag, who would oversee this transformation with much more attention. Where Aravat focused on the integration of the realm into the Arabian and Persian world through what he shared with it, Rosmag took more of an interest in what set his people apart. It wasn't in some sort of hostile or aggressive way, but rather a childlike interest in the history of his parents. Rosmag grew up natively speaking both Scythian and Arabic, but it was clear to him that he was the odd one out for knowing this other language that no one else around him knew. What gave away the unique nature of his realm compared to his peers was that when he pored over the memoirs, chronicles, and stories of his own people, they weren't even written in the same writing system, let alone the same language. Looking to explore those differences, Rosmag began patronizing artists, scholars, and writers of Alan origin, with the hopes of better understanding his origins. By the tender age of 15, he was already aware that he was neither Arab, nor Kurd, nor Persian. It sounds like a simple understanding, but aside from speaking a unique language, Rosmag had no reason to believe he wasn't one of those things, being an Arabian subject and all. Upon reaching 16, Rosmag was a promising scholar, and he immediately dedicated his time to scholarly pursuits. Given the prosperous time of his realm, he did similarly to his grandfather, Taus, and left the realm in the council's hands while he did as he pleased. He traveled to Medina to attend religious lectures from the wisest of the Muslim world, hoping to hear about his own people there. After all, he and his predecessors had been dutiful Muslims for almost a century now. The naive emir hadn't listened to the warnings from his court of the dangers of crossing the desert, and he faced resistance on the way, falling ill and running out of money, but he nonetheless succeeded in his trip. Upon arriving, he prepared to be enlightened, and indeed he was. He was enlightened to the fact that his people were utterly irrelevant to the Muslim world. It was moderately upsetting, to say the least, but also a powerful opportunity that Rosmag wouldn't realize for some time. A people without history that is already written needs only to write and establish itself. Without history, there is freedom from expectations, and freedom from misperception. Rosmag hadn't thought of it yet, but he could potentially be the one to create a Rukshalani history. Regardless of how he felt, Rosmag did learn a ton about the various scriptures of the Abrahamic faiths and the history of the entire Middle East, thanks to the skilled educators of Medina. He went home with some of his favorite books, and this time was much more careful on the desert path back to Tausinia. He had intended to pore over his books, but his subjects were genuinely curious to hear of his trip to Medina, and so he more or less had his hand forced into hosting a feast where he could regale the realm with tales of his trip. He needed the time off anyway to recover from some of the hardships of his adventure. Seeing his people show real interest in their own history and their involvement in the region only filled him with more will to give them what they wanted. From here, Rosmag would study more myths and history and would look to establish his own mythology in time. His obsession over these histories and stories did start to have an effect on him, which some people might point to as insanity, but he'd consider an inspiration. After a few years of rest and reading, Rosmag took a trip to Mecca to make the Hajj. Although he did so outwardly as a religious pilgrimage that he is obligated to undertake as a Muslim, he was more doing this as an opportunity to take several detours and visit mythical places for an inspiration. He would visit Baghdad, Jerusalem, Petra, Damascus, and Samarra, among other legendary locations along the way to Mecca itself, and with the notes he was able to take in those cities, he had obtained enough knowledge to begin the process of creating the Roksholani mythos. The next years would see mostly the minutiae of rulership take up Rosmag's time, where he would consider and write chronicles in his free time, which remained unpublished until they were ready. He did many hunts and engaged in basic courtly duties, but mostly fulfilled the basic responsibilities of being emir without much attention. It was that lack of attention that resulted in his disfigurement at the hands of a hyena while on a hunt with the court. But he found the mask hiding his abominable face quite comfortable, really. It also made it easy to hide his disinterest in most courtly politics, so he saw it as a boon for the most part. He had a son, Xerxes, who would grow up to be a very social child, and who he would often talk to about his ideas. It sounds strange, but children can have the wildest of imaginations and are unrestrained by their expectations of adult society. Although Xerxes would not have been raised properly to be an emir, he was certainly being raised a happy child with his father's attention and stories. In 958, Rosmag was enjoying his late 30s, and around this time he was feeling ready to begin the shaping of his people's identity. He had learned from his travels across the Middle East that the great cultures of history had almost always centered around some kind of great city, which had more or less already been happening among the Roksholani with Tunisia. Nevertheless, Rosmag wanted a fresh slate, so he moved the court capital to Hamadan, which had recently been settled by Alans, and declared it to be the new center of Roksholani culture and power. It was certainly an upgrade from Tausinia development-wise, but it was a place without much history. There was no legendary albino lion, nor any story of an exhausted war veteran stealing the land. This was fresh land, whose foundations had not yet been laid. The emirate of Rosmagna, realm of the Caliphal Alans, was declared, without much notice from the rest of the realm. It continued to be the case that the Arabs saw these frontier Alans simply as subduers of the Kurds, rather than a relevant entity of the realm. This move to a new capital was coincided conveniently with the dissolution of the former Tahirid Sultanate, as pretenders had pulled the kingdom apart. A gargantuan power vacuum opened up in central, northern, and northeastern Persia, but Rosmag was not interested in filling it, as he had his own goals. Instead, he had heard word of his brother and Kermanshah choosing to abandon his Alan roots and become a full-out Kurd. It was true that the Kurds and Alans by this point were blurring the lines of distinction between themselves, but this was unacceptable to Rosmag, who would not see his people diluted, and so he invaded Kermanshah to bring it into Rosmagna. Of course, Tamiraz has enjoyed good relations with his brother since they split their realm, so he was completely taken by surprise and utterly crushed. Afterwards, a grand wedding between the now adult Xerxes and one of Caliph Nusradin's daughters was held in Hamadan. As it turns out that Nusradin did make good on that marriage favor that the late Arabat had called upon. It was a good opportunity for Rosmag to perhaps talk to the Caliph about the elevation of Rosmagna in the eyes of the Arab Empire. It was a bit insulting that his realm was still very much a frontier backwater in the eyes of the Empire. During the wedding, Nusradin made it clear that he was only keeping his word on account of his honor, and that ultimately he was loath to have traveled such an uncivilized section of his realm. He made it clear that these proceedings were nothing but ceremony to him, and that the Alans were not some integral part of the history of the realm. This was heartbreaking, of course, for Rosmag, but he would once again fail to see the advantage of a lack of restraints on his people's perceptions. Indeed, the Alans were not an integral part of the Arabian Empire. Shortly after the wedding, the tension of the Iranian intermezzo had come to an end, as with the Tahirids having collapsed and without any other power to fill that vacuum, the Iranians did not form a competing empire against the Arabs. Yet the Arabs had been content to allow the Alans to form a buffer between them and the Iranians, and so Iran was brought to peace for a time. This did not spell the end of conflict in the region though, considering that Baghdad was still occupied by enemies of the Caliphate. In a combination of feigned loyalty and retaliation, Rosmag declared a war to take Baghdad from the invading Zaydis, who had themselves taken the city from the Turks that took it from the empire. The Caliph was focused on his war efforts in Armenia and with the Romans, and so he left Baghdad in the hands of his Shia enemies. Looking to put the Arab Empire into a false sense of security, he showed his fealty in attempting to take the city while fully intending to keep the House of Wisdom for his own people. That being said, it turned out the Caliph had ignored the Zaydis for what seemed to be a good reason. They were far tougher than it first appeared. Baghdad had become a battleground between Turks, Sunni Arabs, and Shia Arabs, with a fourth element, the Roksholani, now entering the ring, and it was chaos. The Tigris and Euphrates were not quite crimson with blood, but certainly had a browner hue on account of the massive fights and sieges going on there, and the wise Caliph had been letting the local powers fight it out, hoping to snatch up whoever was left in their weakened state. Nonetheless, Rosmag was at war now, and so his armies marched on Baghdad and engaged in a stalemate war for 7 years before signing a white peace. It would cost him his beloved son, Xerxes, who was slain in 974 while fighting the Zaidis. Ultimately, he did not conquer Baghdad, but he instead wasted the lives of many young men, fighting a foe that he provoked. Nonetheless, his bravery was commended by the Caliph, who was just happy to see the Zaidis continuing to be occupied with war. The Zaidi Imam, al-Mu'tadid, was growing old and would soon pass away, leaving a weak realm for the Caliph to conquer. Seeing though that the Caliph did not even recognize his effort except in words and acknowledgements, Rosmag was upset. The Caliph had actually become quite friendly with Rosmag, as he really did appreciate the effect Rosmag was having, and appreciated his iron grip on the once rebellious Kurdish minorities in the realm, but the feeling was not mutual. Rosmag wanted to be elevated as a special subject. He wanted to be a client king of the great Arab Empire, but he was restricted to just being another emir of no special status. Yet the thought ran through his mind again. The Alans were not an integral part of the Arab Empire. It was time to carve out a real destiny for the Alans. Of course, the Arabian Empire was still quite powerful, and there were 2 things that Rosmag would wait for: the death of Nusra-Din, which he may expedite, and a multi-front war which would occupy the new caliph's attention. Nusra-Din's death was already written on the wall given how he was in his 70s, but ensuring that the Arabs would be busy was mostly out of his hands. In 983, Rosmag had actually arranged for Nusra-Din's death, but his plot failed, only for Nusra-Din to collapse of old age just a few weeks later. I guess that counts. It was also at the same time that the empire was occupied with a war in Nubia, and the new caliph, Radi, was not exactly of the martial mind. This was it. Rosmag did not renew his oath of fealty to the new caliph, and so declared that he would fight for his independence. He raised his armies and marched down the mountains into the Mesopotamian plains, only to find absolutely no Abbasid resistance. It seemed they were too busy in Africa to put up a fight, and that would turn out to be true, as after doing a few small-scale raids throughout Mesopotamia, Rosmag received word that the caliph would be accepting his independence and the war was ended. While anticlimactic, it was a relief to the common folk of Rosmagna to see that there wouldn't be yet another protracted conflict with the Arabs that led to nothing. Rosmagna was free of any shackles they had to the Arabian Empire, but also had to fend for itself. This wasn't much of a negative considering the realm had already been defending itself from Turkic incursions constantly. Shortly after gaining independence, Rosmag unveiled his grand plan for the realm. He was no longer just some borderland or buffer, but instead a new ruling power of the Zagros Mountains. Rosmagna was to be elevated to a kingdom, which at least internally in the realm maintained its name, but would be renamed by Arab scholars to Al-Scythia, in reference to the Alan origins as Scythian descendants. Alongside this elevation of the realm, Rosmag released his chronicles, detailing stories and myths about the Shining Alans. He incorporated the Great March of Taus from Basra to Bailakan, and the founding of Tausinia. He wrote of the Great White Lion and the conquest of Azerbaijan. He also wrote of more humble stories, including one of friendship between a Shining Alan and a Kurd, who would compete to prove who were better athletes, as they scaled different mountain peaks within the western Zagros. It was a unifying moment for the Rokshalani and Kurds, whose influence on one another had brought them together. While at least amongst themselves, still being separate but friendly, Arabian scholars would label the mountain folk of the western Zagros as the Scythians, differentiating them from the Alans of the Caucasus and the Kurds of southern Armenia. Indeed, the Kurdo-Alan people formed a new class of people within the mountain kingdom of Al-Scythia, and the history and mythology of the kingdom was intertwined with Kurdish tradition. Particularly, the Kurds contributed to the Alan mythology in the form of oral storytelling. Where Rosmag was a writer and a scholar, and so his stories were written and recorded, the Kurds embraced these chronicles themselves, but as memorized ballads that they would tell one another. Naturally, the Kurdish renditions would alter over time, with each recitation finding new evolutions based on the creativity of the one reciting it. Alongside those chronicles, Rosmag also encouraged the introduction of Persian language in his realm, given its immense prestige as a lingua franca, and that he wanted to make his new kingdom a place of intellectual transaction. He held no enmity with Arabs nor Persians, instead hoping to simply be held in equal esteem to them. He had no intention of eradicating or dominating the already culturally dominant people of the region. He only wished to contribute. There was, of course, some turbulence on the way to the great scholarly leap of Rosmagna, though, and that was an up till now little-known newcomer to the area, the Seljuk Turks. While Rosmag and his ancestors had dealt with Turkic invaders for some years by this point, the Seljuks were on a higher level than the others. It was their assumption that a recently freed foe would not be prepared to fight off another war, but they didn't know that the Abbasids had more or less peacefully allowed the Alans to go, and so the Seljuks marched on Hamadan, expecting little resistance. They were quite wrong. The Alan horse archers and the Kurdish Tawashi cavalry made short work of the Turks, whose men were not well acquainted with the mountains and valleys of the Zagros, and although the Seljuks were persistent, they were not able to come even close to defeating the coalition forces of the Alans and Kurds. In particular, a Kurdish knight, Istor, has earned himself a place in the mythology of Rosmag's tales as a knight who was a mercenary fighting for the Zaidis of little note that was promised freedom if he fought for the Alans. He of course accepted, being aware of the kinship between his Kurdish people and the Alans. He turned into an acclaimed knight famous for his leadership of the entire Rosmagna cavalry army, and he routed the Seljuk forces with ease. Istor's tale, which recounted the mercy of the Alans and the loyalty of the Kurds, would inspire knightly tales within Rosmagna for years to come, but for the time being, Istor was reaching old age. For his service, he was given the hand of Rosmag's daughter, Gergana, in the hopes of showing that loyal subjects are rewarded. As winter began, the Seljuks surrendered and left Rosmagna in peace, suffering a great loss that slowed their great conquest heavily. The Seljuks appeared to be filling the void of power that the Tahirids left, but they would not cross the Alans. Just 1 year later though, Rosmag would lie down and write his last story. He wrote of the Seljuks, and in either a burst of delirium or creativity, he wrote of the Great White Lion, ridden by Istor, leading the cavalry in a charge against the Seljuks. The lion ripped the throats of Seljuk soldiers and pounced upon horse archers whose mounts had thrown them aside in abject fear of the albino lion. This was the only story in the mythology that was said to have been entirely fictional, although Rosmag insisted it was true. The ramblings of an old man, it was concluded. He passed away in September of 996, leaving a legacy that would not just impact the Kurdo-Alan Confederation, but rather define it. Rosmag was buried with his father and grandfather, adorned with symbolism of his great mythologies. The great founder of the Shining Alan nation, Rosmag, was without a doubt the most important figure in their history, and the realm observed several weeks of grieving. Rosmag would become a story of his own, although one which had not yet been written. The Kurds were already finding beautiful melodies to suit his great achievements, but it would take a writer on par with the man himself to possibly put the story to words. The Shining Alans had a new leader, Beketar, who had served in the war against the Seljuks. He was similar to his father, but more interested in matters of military. He had big shoes to fill, but luckily, the Seljuks, who were looking like the new scourge of Iran, were just waiting to be vanquished by a young man looking to prove himself. Whether Beketar can keep the realm safe is unknown, but for now, this ends the tale of Taus Awar, the Shining Alan. A humble mercenary Alan, Taus, would fight for his wealthy employers, the Abbasids, but upon losing his leg and finding himself without pay, he would establish himself as a noble subject of the Abbasid Caliphate. It was through petty bullying that he was motivated to assassinate a key caliph that Taus would upend the Arabian order and force the Arabs to contend with the near collapse of their empire. Eventually, Taus would settle in a new home after losing his other new home to Turkic invaders, and after inviting a great Arab statesman to effectively build his realm for him, he would obsess over an albino lion. His independent mind and loose loyalty earned him the title of renegade amongst Arab historians. His successor, while ambitious in thought, was mostly irrelevant in action. Aravat had in mind truly great things for his realm and himself, but through circumstances out of his control, would only watch over and over as his schemes and plots failed at every opportunity. It was the hands-off nature of his rulership, as he simply allowed the Arab statesmen and Persian scholars to develop his land, that he would leave his mark on what would become Rosmagna. Aravat is not solely to blame for the destruction of the Tahirids, but his inability to prove a worthy ally would certainly contribute to the eventual dissolution and balkanization of the eastern Iranian world, setting the stage for Seljuk invasion. For this he was known as a hapless schemer, unaware of the consequences of his meddling. The consequences of Aravat's failure would not be felt until the reign of Rosmag, whose scholarly pursuits would create the Shining Alan identity in earnest. It was by working with, rather than against, the Kurds that he was able to assemble a realm of genuine peace and cooperation. The Alans and Kurds shared in their skill with horse husbandry and mountain living to create a realm powerful enough to defy the great Arabian Empire. They shared in their respective skills of oral and written storytelling to create a culture on par with the Arabs and Persians. And they shared in their determination to resist and defeated the Seljuks, who otherwise may have become the new masters of Iran. It was thanks to Rosmag that the Shining Alans would even enter the annals of history, and so he is the true nation builder and founder of the Shining Alans as a relevant cultural group. The new Amir-e-Emiran, Beketar, has inherited the realm, and he has great ancestors to look to for inspiration. May his exploits reach similar heights. This has been the story of the Shining Alans. Thank you for your time.